On October 12, 1951, at 3 o'clock midnight, the prisoner transport train set off with a clang and a groan. From the Krasnoyarsk transit prison, Aglaya Vexler, convicted under Article 58, to 10 years in the camps, lay on the third upper bunk of the Stolypin car, breathing in the stale, heavy air permeated with the smells of unwashed bodies, Makorka tobacco, fear, and cheap carbolic acid. The cold pierced her to the bone. The metal wall of the car, which she pressed her shoulder against, was covered in icy frost, and her thin camp jacket offered no protection from its merciless touch. Under her head, instead of a pillow, was a bundle tied from her belongings, with her only change of underwear and a crust of stale bread. Hunger was her constant companion, a dull, aching pain in her stomach that had long become part of her very being. But now, under the rhythmic clatter of the wheels carrying her into the unknown of Kolyma or Norilsk, hunger receded into the background. It was overshadowed by the cold and an all-consuming, animalistic desire to break free. Her past, Leningrad, the university, lectures on comparative linguistics, the laughter of friends in a dusty auditorium, the smell of old books, seemed not just another life, but an invented, dreamed-up one. The reality was the interrogations on Lidiny Prospect, solitary confinement in the Kresty prison, the sentence from the Troika for a carelessly dropped phrase about the leader of the peoples, and a forbidden volume of Gamilia found during the search. The 22-year-old philology student died the day the cell door slammed shut behind her. Inside this emaciated, short-cropped creature with dull gray eyes, only will remained, not even for life but for struggle. She had no intention of dying as an obedient, nameless splinter in the icy stream of the Gulag. If she was to die, it would be on the run, breathing free air, not the consumptive dust of a barak. The motivation was simple and absolute, like an axiom. They had taken everything from her, but they would not get her submission. Escape was not a hope for salvation, but a final act of self-assertion, the only choice left to her. The idea was born back at the transit prison inn, the dirty, overcrowded barak where criminals played cards for rations, and the political prisoners quietly faded from dysentery and despair. She listened to everything. The boastful tales of seasoned thieves about escapes, the conversations of the guards, snippets of phrases from the escorts. She absorbed information like dry earth absorbs water. An old thief nicknamed Fedet Kryuk, who had lost his daily ration to her because she wrote a letter home for him, spat contemptuously, looking at her thin wrists. "Where do you think you're going, FIFA? The taiga is a harsh prosecutor. You'll get lost? A rogue bear will carry out the sentence. This isn't from books. You need to feel it in your gut. Water washes away the trail. Follow an animal path. The dogs will break their noses. If you head into the swamp in autumn, they won't find you until spring." He said this to humiliate her, but Aglaya remembered. Every word, every detail lodged in her mind, forming a ghostly, desperate plan. This would not be just an escape. It would be immersion into another element where human laws ceased to apply. Her struggle for survival began long before she took her first step into freedom. It began in her head. The Stolypin car, as the prisoners called it, was a fortress on wheels. Small cells for 9 people, bars on the windows, a barred door to the corridor where the escort was always on duty. But Aglaya knew that every system has weak points. She deliberately secured a spot on the upper bunk near the toilet compartment, a tiny, chlorine-stinking cubicle with a hole in the floor. It was the dirtiest and most humiliating place in the car, so the guards checked there least often. The window in the toilet was covered with a thick sheet of iron, but she noticed that one of the bolts securing it to the wooden frame was rusted. The wood around it had rotted from constant dampness. She needed a tool, a prisoner's weapon and tool, a shank. During the last distribution of slop at the transit prison, she managed to secretly grab an aluminum spoon. All night before the transport, hiding under a blanket, she ground it against the concrete floor of the barak, turning the handle into a crude but sharp awl. Now this shank, wrapped in rags, was her only hope. The journey ahead was long, at least a week. She had time. Every day, under the pretext of necessity, she made her way to the toilet compartment. The other women in the cell, an exhausted peasant woman from near Poltava, two petty criminals, a silent old sectarian woman. Looked at her with indifference or suspicion. There could be no allies here. Telling anyone about the plan meant signing her own death warrant. She was alone, pressed against the wall, pretending to be nauseous. She, hidden from the peephole in the door, chipped away at the rotten wood around the rusted bolt centimeter by centimeter. The clatter of wheels, the shouts of the guards, the moans of the sick, all this infernal noise was her cover. Her fingers went numb from cold and strain. Several times she was nearly caught. Once a guard, a young red-haired guy, yanked the door open too abruptly. Aglaia managed to pull her hand away and lean her forehead against the wall, feigning a bout of nausea. "What are you sitting around for, Contra?" he growled. "Get back to your bunk." Her heart pounded so hard it seemed audible throughout the car. This was the first moment she thought it was all over. But he left, and she continued her work, trembling. On the fourth day of the journey, the bolt gave way. She was able to pull it out of the crumbly wood. Now the iron sheet was held by only 3 others. Aglaia knew she had to choose the right moment. The train was passing through the endless Siberian taiga. Outside the window flashed endless walls of larches and cedars dusted with the first snow. Sometimes the train slowed on long ascents or sharp turns. This was her chance. She had studied a map she once saw in a university atlas and roughly imagined their route north along the Yenisei. If she jumped, it should be at a river bend where the train would go slowest. She would have to navigate by the sun and stars, if they were visible. There was little hope, but it was there. On the 5th day of the journey, trouble struck. An unscheduled search began. 2 guards and an officer suddenly took interest in their cell. "Everyone out into the corridor. Hands behind your backs," came the command. Panic washed over Aglaia like an icy wave. Her shank, her only chance, was hidden in a crack under the bunks. If they found it, it wasn't just solitary, this was execution for preparing an escape. The women were roughly shoved into the narrow passage. One of the soldiers began methodically tapping the walls and bunks. Aglaia stood pressed against the bars, watching him approach her spot. She was already saying goodbye to life. At that moment, the old sectarian woman standing next to her suddenly groaned loudly and began to slump to the floor. "Water!" she cried in a hoarse voice. "I'm dying." This distracted the guards. While they tried to lift the old woman, the search was cut short. The officer waved his hand. "All right, herd them back in. We'll deal with this one later." When Aglaia returned to her spot, she saw the old woman looking at her with clear, meaningful eyes. She said not a word, but in her gaze Aglaia read understanding. It wasn't alliance. It was a fleeting act of human compassion that saved her life. On the 6th night, she knew the time had come. The train moved slowly, puffing heavily uphill and leaning sharply on turns. Outside, a blizzard howled. Perfect conditions. The snow would hide her tracks and muffle the sound of her fall. She waited until the guard changed in the corridor. The new escort was lazy and immediately sat on his stool at the far end of the corridor, lighting a cigarette. "I feel sick," Aglaia whispered to her neighbor and, without waiting for a response, slipped off the bunk. In the toilet, she acted quickly and precisely. She tucked the shank into the top of her boot, felt the edge of the iron sheet. Her strength wasn't enough. She leaned her whole body against it, bracing her feet against the opposite wall. The metal creaked. Her heart dropped to her heels. She froze, listening. It was quiet in the corridor, only the rhythmic swaying and clatter of wheels. One more effort. The sheet gave way, bending back several dozen centimeters. A narrow gap formed. Icy wind and a whirlwind of snow rushed in, smelling of freedom and pine needles. She looked out. Below, in the darkness, a snowy slope rushed by. The speed seemed monstrous. Fear gripped her, but the thought of the Norilsk barracks was more terrifying. She threw one leg over the edge. Her body wouldn't obey, trembling from cold and horror. One last glance back into the stinking, cramped darkness of the car. And the jump. A jump into the roaring, prickly, icy void. The flight lasted an eternity and an instant. The icy wind, whipping her breath away, tore off her wretched headscarf. Aglaia instinctively curled into a ball, as she had been taught in distant, peaceful gym classes. Chin to chest, arms pressed close. The ground, or rather, the high railway embankment covered in deep, loose snow, hit her not so much harshly as deafeningly. She rolled down the slope several times, choking on snow that filled her mouth and nose, and finally froze, buried up to her waist in a snowdrift. Pain everywhere, in her bruised ribs, in her dislocated shoulder, in every muscle cramped from the impact and cold. For several seconds, she lay motionless, unable even to breathe. Her only clear thought was, alive. Then came realization. Above her, rumbling heavily, the train departed. The prison. The red lights of the last car grew smaller and smaller until they dissolved in the snowy whirl. And then silence descended. Absolute, primordial, deafening silence of the taiga, broken only by the whistle of the wind in the crowns of mighty cedars. She was alone, free and completely defenseless. She struggled out of the snowdrift. Her feet sank into the snow. Her wet clothes immediately began to crust with ice. The cold was not just a sensation. It was a physical enemy, piercing her body with thousands of needles. She looked around. As far as the eye could see, a black, impenetrable forest stood. No lights, no sounds of human life. The scale of the task before her crashed down with all its monstrous weight. To survive here without food, without fire, in just a jacket. First things first, away from the railroad. She knew that as soon as her escape was discovered, and it would be soon, at the next station during guard change or if one of the female prisoners informed earlier, a search party with dogs would follow her trail right from here. She forced herself to move. Every step was a struggle. Her dislocated shoulder burned with fire. Breathing hurt. She walked, stumbling and falling, trying to go as deep into the forest as possible, perpendicular to the railway track. She tried to recall Fedet Kryuk's advice. Follow an animal path. But in the darkness, in the storm under a half-meter layer of snow, no paths were visible. She just trudged blindly, pushing through prickly thickets and sinking into snowdrifts. After an hour or two, she no longer felt time. Her strength began to fail. Her body stopped shivering, and that was a bad sign. Dangerous numbness was setting in, a harbinger of freezing. She desperately wanted to just lie down in the snow and sleep. She understood that it would be her last sleep. The image of her mother, executed in 37, appeared before her eyes. No, she wouldn't give them another victory. She would fight. She began rubbing her face and hands with snow, trying to get her blood flowing, forcing herself to move faster, shifting to an awkward, shuffling trot. Suddenly, ahead, through the howl, she heard a sound. A thin, drawn-out whistle, a train. But the sound was different, alarming, intermittent. It came from the direction where her train had gone. It had stopped. Her heart turned to an icy lump. They had discovered it. They already knew. She imagined the commotion in the car, the furious face of the convoy chief, soldiers jumping onto the tracks. Soon dogs would be here. Her lead of a few hours was melting before her eyes. Panic spurred her, giving new strength. She ran, not choosing a path, breaking branches with her face, falling and rising again. She was lucky. After a few hundred meters, she stumbled upon a frozen stream. The ice was thin and crackled under her weight, but held. Water washes away the trail. She walked right along the bed, sometimes sinking ankle-deep into icy water. Her feet went numb instantly, but she knew this was her only chance to throw off the dogs. She walked along this icy corridor until the stream led her to a small river, already covered in a thick layer of ice. Here the wind was even stronger. It drove the drifting snow, covering her shallow tracks on the ice almost instantly. She went upstream, reasoning that the search party would most likely assume she was heading south toward warmth and possible settlements. She would go north, into the depths of the vast, uninhabited wilderness. It was suicidal, but that's why it might work. Dawn caught her on the riverbank. The blizzard subsided, and through the ragged gray clouds broke a pale, unwarming light. She saw what she had gotten herself into. In all directions to the horizon stretched the snow-covered taiga, majestic, silent, and absolutely indifferent to the tiny human figure on the shore. She was like a speck in the ocean. The feeling of freedom, so sharp in the first minutes, gave way to an oppressive sense of loneliness and fear. She examined herself. Her jacket was torn in several places. Her pants were soaked through, her hands and face covered in bleeding scratches. Her sharpened spoon, her only treasure, fortunately remained tucked in her boot top. She needed shelter and fire. Without fire, she wouldn't survive the next night. But how to make it? No matches, no lighter. Her thoughts raced feverishly. Flint, friction. These were knowledge from books, completely useless here. In the wet, cold forest, she found a shallow ravine sheltered from the wind by dense spruces. She had no strength left. She began gathering dry spruce branches, trying to make something like a nest to at least insulate herself from the frozen ground. Her hands wouldn't obey. Her fingers were like wood. She worked mechanically, driven only by instinct. And then she heard it. Distant but distinct barking of dogs, not one, but a whole pack. It came from the direction of the railroad and was getting closer. Then, added to the barking, a new sound, low and rumbling. It grew, and a minute later, above the treetops, appeared a reconnaissance plane.
Apo dva biplane.
It flew low, circling over the forest. Had they spotted her? Or was this just a sweep of the area? Aglaia froze, pressed into the snow under overhanging spruce branches. The plane made another circle and flew away. But the dogs, their barking didn't stop. They were on her trail. The stream hadn't helped. Or it had, but not for long. They had picked up the scent again. It was all over. For the second time in a day, that thought burned her brain. She had only covered a few kilometers. She had no strength to run further. They would catch her within an hour. To lie down and surrender, return to the car, to the stench, to humiliation, and then to solitary, to torture, to the execution wall.
No.
She looked around. The ravine, deep snow. She began frantically burrowing into a snowdrift under the roots of an uprooted spruce, working with hands and feet like a crazed animal. She piled snow on herself, leaving only a tiny hole for breathing. In a few minutes, she was completely hidden under the white blanket. She lay in her snowy grave, barely breathing, and listened. The barking grew louder. She heard cracking branches, voices. Here, here, Rex. They were right nearby. The dog barking sounded directly above her head. She felt the snow above her vibrate from footsteps. Now they would find her. Now they would prod her with a bayonet, or a dog's paw would dig up her hiding place. Time stopped. She closed her eyes, awaiting the end. Suddenly, the barking shifted, began to recede. The voices too. Lost the trail, came an irritated shout. Went to the river, I tell you, search there. The pursuit passed by, literally a few meters from her. The snow and wind had done their job. Her scent dissipated, and the shallow pit in the ravine was invisible from above. For another 10 minutes, she lay motionless, afraid to move. Then, when all was quiet, she slowly, with enormous effort, began to climb out of her shelter. She was wet, frozen, on the verge of losing consciousness, but alive and alone again. The pursuit had gone in another direction, but she knew it was only a temporary reprieve. They would comb the whole square. The camp administration wouldn't forgive such audacity. They would throw all forces at her capture. The escape wasn't over. It had only begun, and ahead was her first night in the taiga. State Security Major Gromov arrived at the scene 2 hours after the train made an emergency stop at the Tajinka siding. He was a man in his middle years, with a tired face etched with wrinkles and cold, attentive eyes. Gromov disliked fuss and senseless rage. He was a professional and viewed prisoner escapes not as personal insults but as systemic failures that needed to be methodically corrected. After listening to the convoy chief's rambling report, he silently walked to the damaged window of the car, examined the traces, the rusted bolt lying on the floor. "A student, you say? Article 58, he asked without turning. "That's right, Comrade Major. Vexler Aglaia Lazarevna." She was quiet, unnoticeable. Gromov smirked to himself. The quiet ones are the most dangerous. He stepped out of the car into the frost. 2 internal troops with service sheepdogs were already examining the embankment. "Here, Comrade Major," one of them shouted. "This is where she jumped. Tracks in the snowdrift." Gromov slowly descended the slope. He squatted, examined the imprint of the body in the snow, assessed the depth. The snow is soft. She was lucky, probably alive, possibly injured, but not severely. His gaze swept the forest edge. an endless, hostile wall of trees. "Release the dogs," he ordered. "A group of 10 men. Take 3 days' rations. Flares move in a fan. Main direction, south toward habitation. Second group combs the riverbank in both directions. I'll go with the first." He had no doubt that the fugitive was a dilettante. An intellectual well-read in books, she wouldn't get far. She'd freeze, get scared, come out to people herself, or be caught within a day. This was routine work, but something in the audacity of this escape, alone, in winter, from a moving train, hooked him. There was a desperate madness in it that couldn't be underestimated. Aglaia, climbing out of her snowy hiding place, understood that staying put was suicide. The search party could return at any moment. She had to move, but where? Instinct drove her away from the river, deeper into the forest. She walked, barely feeling her feet, which had turned into 2 icy blocks. The pain in her shoulder became dull and constant. Her main enemy now was not Major Grimoff, whose existence she didn't know, but the cold. It seeped under her clothes, stiffened her movements, clouded her mind. She knew she needed fire. It was an obsession, the only thought burning in her freezing brain. She began searching not for food or water, but for what could produce fire. Dry birch bark, resinous branches, tinder fungus, which she had read about in some book. She tore bark from birches with numb fingers, stuffing the damp, crumpled pieces into her bosom. She broke off lower dry spruce branches. All this was pointless without a spark. She pulled out her shank, tried striking it against a stone protruding from the snow. Useless. The aluminum was too soft. Despair began to creep in with renewed force. She sat on a fallen tree, and for the first time since the escape, tears flowed from her eyes. They immediately froze on her cheeks into prickly icicles. She had escaped a slow death in the camp to die a quick and cruel one here, in this white hell. It was at this moment of complete exhaustion that she saw it. About 100 meters away, among the trees, a dark shadow flashed. Person? An animal? Her heart froze. She hid behind the trunk of a huge cedar, afraid to breathe. The shadow moved again. It was a moose, a huge forest bull, making its way through the thicket. He didn't see her. He went his own way, breaking undergrowth and leaving a wide, deep trail in the snow. And then Fedet Kryuk's words flashed in her mind. "Follow an animal path, the dogs will break their noses." The scent of such a large animal as a moose was much stronger than her own. If dogs followed her trail, they might get confused. Follow him. This was a chance. A false hope that could turn into new danger. A meeting with a predator following the moose. But it was the only chance she had. Gathering her last strength, she rushed to the trail left by the moose. Walking along it was incomparably easier. The snow was packed, and she didn't sink with every step. She tried to step exactly in the animal's tracks, hoping her scent would mix with his. She walked like this for about an hour, until the trail led her to a small clearing, in the center of which stood a lopsided, half-ruined hut. A hunter's cabin, abandoned. Her heart beat with new force. Shelter. Perhaps there was something useful there. She ran to the hut. The door hung on one hinge. Inside was empty, dark, and smelled of rot and mice. The roof leaked, and a whole snowdrift had piled up in the corner. But these were walls, protection from the wind. In the corner, she found what made her cry out in joy. A rusty potbelly stove, and next to it a few logs and a crumbly box. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside, among the trash, lay them. 3 matches, 3 priceless, life-saving matches. This was the first moment of real happiness in recent years. She almost cried again, but now they were tears of hope. She plugged the cracks in the walls with snow and spruce branches as best she could. She gathered birch bark and dry twigs she had kept in her bosom. She piled it all into the stove. Her hands shook so much she feared breaking the precious matches. She took one, struck it against the box. The head was damp and crumbled. Panic. 2 left. She took the second match, held her breath, struck harder, sharper. Fire. A small, trembling tongue of flame. She carefully brought it to the birch bark. It reluctantly smoked, then flared up. The fire jumped to the small twigs. In a few minutes, flames roared merrily in the stove. Warmth, divine, Life-giving warmth began to spread through the tiny hut. Aglaya sat on the floor in front of the open stove door and extended her numb hands to the fire. She was saved, at least for this night. She spent several hours by the fire, gradually thawing, took off her wet boots and footcloths, hung them to dry. The pain in her shoulder and ribs returned with new force, but the warmth dulled it. She even dozed off, but woke abruptly from a sharp crack outside. She froze, listening. Another crack. Someone was approaching the hut. The pursuit? Couldn't be. They couldn't have found her here. She rushed to the door, peered through the crack. In the twilight, she saw two figures approaching the clearing. Soldiers? No, their clothes were civilian. Hunters, vagrants, whoever they were heading straight to her shelter. Smoke from the chimney. They had seen the smoke. What stupidity. She had given herself away. It was all over. For the third time in a day. There was nowhere to run. She was trapped. She grabbed her shank, a pitiful weapon against two men. Her heart pounded in her throat. The men approached the hut. One was tall and thin, the other stocky with a thick beard. They stopped at the door. "Hey, anyone alive in there?" came a hoarse bass. Aglaya was silent, huddled in the darkest corner. She saw their silhouettes in the doorway. "Seems like no one," said the second. "But where's the smoke from? Maybe someone was here before us?" Embers left. They entered. Aglaya held her breath. Her fate was being decided in these seconds. One of them stepped to the stove, extended his hand to the warmth. And then he saw her. She stood in the shadow with eyes mad from fear, clutching the sharpened spoon. The man recoiled. "Whoa, look, Michaelik, there's a woman here." The second turned. For several seconds, they silently stared at her. This wasn't the pursuit. This was an encounter, possibly even more dangerous. She was alone in the deep taiga with two unknown men. And the night was just beginning. The men, named Stepan and Michaelik, turned out to be escaped criminals, thieves who had fled from a logging camp somewhere on the Angara. They were rough, cruel, and looked at Aglaya like prey. The first hours were torture. They took her last match and the remnants of bread she had dried by the fire. They laughed at her intellectual appearance and her pitiful weapon. "What? Were you gonna stab a guard with that, FIFA?" Stepan laughed. The tall and wiry one with shifty, malicious eyes. Michaelik, bearded and taciturn, simply sat by the fire and sharpened his huge knife. Aglaya realized she had escaped one mortal danger only to fall into another. She was silent, trying to be as inconspicuous as possible, answering questions monosyllabically. She said she was a petty criminal convicted of theft, hoping that would evoke more understanding than a political article. At night, when they fell asleep, drunk on homemade brew they carried with them, she tried to escape, quietly slipping out of the hut and dashing into the forest. But they weren't so simple. She hadn't run 100 meters when Stepan caught up to her. A blow to the face knocked her down. "Try that again, and I'll slit your throat and bury you in the snow," he hissed, dragging her back by the hair. "You'll be useful to us yet. You'll cook, prepare food, and carry our stuff." This was the bottom. She had broken out of the camp hell only to fall into slavery to two scumbags. The hope that had flared up from finding shelter and fire extinguished. She became a thing again, property. The following weeks turned into a nightmare. They headed south, but without a map or compass, often circling in place. Aglaya carried their things, gathered firewood, cooked meager food from what they managed to get. Squirrels shot with a homemade gun or a hare caught in a snare. She got only scraps. She constantly hungered and froze. But the worst was the humiliation. They didn't see her as a human. However, paradoxically, this time became her school of survival. Observing them, she learned. She saw how Michaelik set snares for hares, memorized where to look for bird nests. She watched how Stepan stripped bark from trees to start a fire, how he determined directions by moss on trunks. She absorbed these skills like a sponge, understanding that this was her only capital. Her philologist's brain, accustomed to analysis and systematization, now worked in a different mode. It analyzed the forest, animal habits, weather signs. She ceased to be Aglaya Wexler. She turned into a creature for whom the main thing was to live until the next dawn. The transformation was not only internal but external. Her hair grew out into dirty, matted tangles. Her facial skin weathered, cracked, and darkened from campfire smoke. Her hands were covered in calluses and unhealing scratches. Her gaze became hard, wary, like a wild animal's. She learned to move through the forest almost silently. She learned to sit motionless for hours, observing. The civilized person in her died, giving way to a primordial hunter and gatherer. She no longer thought of Leningrad, books, her past life. Those memories caused too much pain. Her world narrowed to food, warmth, and safety. The crisis came about a month into their joint wanderings. They ran out of salt, and food became completely bland and tasteless. But worse was that Michalik, who, as it turned out, suffered from an old camp disease, had a scurvy flare-up. His gums bled, his teeth loosened. He became weak and apathetic. Stepan, seeing his partner turning into a burden, grew angrier. One morning, he simply didn't give Michalik his share of food. "Enough feeding a freeloader," he snapped. This was a death sentence. Aglaya looked at the dying Michalik, and for the first time in a long while, something like pity stirred in her. He was a scoundrel, but he was human and he was dying. And then she remembered, somewhere, sometime, she had read or heard that a decoction of pine needles helps with scurvy. She gathered young pine needles, melted snow in a pot, and threw them into the boiling water. It made a bitter, resin-smelling drink. Stepan looked at her suspiciously. "What are you up to, witch? Trying to poison him to make it easier for us?" "It's for scurvy," Aglaya said quietly. "It can't get worse." She brought the pot to Michalik's lips. He managed a few sips with difficulty. For several days, she fed him this decoction, and a miracle happened. The gum bleeding lessened. Strength began to return to him. Stepan watched this with grim astonishment. He didn't say thank you, but his attitude toward Aglaya changed. He stopped seeing her as just a woman. He saw knowledge in her, a strength he lacked. This was her first small step from slave. If not to equal partner, then to valuable resource. However, this small success turned into new trouble. One day, crossing a frozen river, Stepan, walking ahead, fell through the ice. The current was weak, and he managed to get out, but he was soaked to the skin in the icy wind. By evening, he had a terrible fever, pneumonia. Now he lay by the fire, shaking with chills and delirium. The roles reversed. Michalik, still weak but indebted to Aglaya for his life, looked bewilderedly from her to his comrade. Now their survival depended entirely on her. Everything she had learned had to pass the test. She set snares, checked them. Sometimes they were empty and then they starved. Sometimes luck was with her, and she brought a hare or grouse. She kept the fire going day and night, gave Stepan hot pine decoction, changed his head bandages. There was no sympathy in her for this cruel man, but the cold calculation of a survivor. While he lived, she had a chance. Alone in the taiga, she couldn't survive. At least that's what she thought then. Stepan pulled through, but the illness greatly weakened him. He became feebler, and his former thuggish arrogance subsided. Now they were more like a strange, desperate trio fighting for life than masters and slave. But ahead awaited the main trial. Winter. The snow grew deeper, frosts intensified, food scarcer. They built a wretched dugout, insulating it with spruce branches and moss. But the cold still pierced to the bone. And one day, checking snares, Aglaya saw tracks in the snow. Not animal, human. Ski tracks. Fresh. Someone had been here. A hunter, forester, or worse, a search patrol. She rushed back to the dugout. "We have to leave," she told the men. People were here. They hastily gathered their meager belongings and moved on. But it was too late. As they emerged into a clearing, they heard barking, that same camp, vicious barking. Then shouts. They were surrounded. From behind the trees came people in sheepskin coats with rifles at the ready. Internal troop soldiers. This was the end. All the efforts, all the hell she had gone through, all in vain. Stepan and Michalik raised their hands. Aglaya froze, staring at the rifle barrels pointed at her chest. In the soldier's eyes, she saw nothing but cold dutifulness. It was all over, finally and irrevocably. But at the moment when the soldier stepped toward her to grab her, Stepan, standing nearby, did something unexpected. With a wild roar, he lunged not at the soldiers, but sideways into the thicket. "Run!" he shouted to Aglaya. It was so unexpected that the soldiers hesitated for a moment. All attention switched to him. 2 dogs were released from leashes and chased after him. A shot rang out, then another. Aglaia, obeying his last command, bolted in the opposite direction. She heard shouts behind her, shots, scuffling. They were subduing Michaelik, but no one pursued her. The whole squad was occupied with the 2 thieves. She ran, not choosing a path, driven by adrenaline and the last desperate chance her tormentor had given her. She ran until she collapsed exhausted into a deep snowdrift, gasping and sobbing. She didn't know why Stepan had done it. Perhaps it was the thug's code not to betray your own. Or maybe something human awakened in him. She would never know. She was alone again, but now she was different. She had survived her first winter in the taiga. She knew how to set snares, start fires, and treat illnesses. She was no longer a victim. She was a fighter. But this skirmish with the patrol left its mark on her. During the fall, she had badly hit her leg on a stone hidden under the snow. The pain was sharp and piercing. When she tried to stand, her leg wouldn't hold her. She looked down and saw her shin bent unnaturally. A fracture, an open fracture. Blood dripped from the ragged wound onto the snow, and she was alone in the middle of the winter taiga, dozens of kilometers from any habitation, with a shattered leg. The pain was all-consuming. It overshadowed the cold, hunger, and fear. White-hot, it pulsed in her shattered leg, radiating waves through her whole body. Aglaia lay in the snow, staring at her unnaturally bent shin and the dark stain of blood slowly spreading around. She tried to move, and a new explosion of pain made her scream. The cry came out weak, like the whine of a wounded animal, and immediately drowned in the taiga's silence. This was the end. A ridiculous, inglorious end. Not from a guard's bullet, not from hunger, not from a bear's claws, but from a random stone under the snow. All her struggle, months of suffering, humiliation, and small victories, all led to this moment, to this pit in the snow from which she could no longer escape. Despair was cold and sticky. It was worse than the pain. She closed her eyes. Her consciousness began to cloud, to drift away. Images flickered before her inner eye. Here was her father, Lazar Vexler, professor of Oriental Studies, leaving in the blizzard of 37, tossing over his shoulder, "I'll be back soon, daughter," and never returning. Here was her interrogator on Lidini with soft, manicured hands and an unbearably weary gaze, monotonously repeating, "Sign it, Aglaia Lazarevna, ease your fate and our work." Here was Stepan's face, distorted in a death cry. Run! Why had he done it? Why give her this last useless chance, so she could die here, alone, instead of in a camp infirmary? Her inner monologue turned into feverish delirium. She argued with herself. Why had she escaped? For what? To prove to them she wasn't cattle. She proved it. And now what? She lay here, turning into a frozen corpse that foxes would gnaw in spring. Freedom. What is freedom? The right to die your own death. What irony! In the camp, she at least had a ration of slop and a bunk, but here only pain and endless snow. Maybe she should have stayed, endured, waited, hoped for amnesty, for a miracle? No, that thought was even more revolting than the thought of death. To die free, even such a terrible death, was still better than living as a slave. This simple, clear thought momentarily pierced the fog of pain and despair. Yes, it was worth it. Every step, every minute of this hell was worth it. She didn't regret it. She was just very tired. The snow fell thicker. Large, heavy flakes settled on her face, on the open wound. She no longer felt the cold. Indifference set in. She knew it was dangerous, that it was agony, but she had no strength left to fight. Let it end. Let silence and darkness just come. She began to sink into a viscous, warm sleep, and at that moment, on the very edge between life and death, she heard barking. But it wasn't the malicious, baying bark of the camp sheepdogs. It was low, hoarse, somehow substantial barking. The dog was barking not at her, but simply announcing its presence. Aglaia opened her eyes with difficulty. From behind the trees, shrouded in snowy haze like a vision, emerged a man. He was of enormous stature, in a long sheepskin coat belted with a rope, in a high fur hat. A thick, gray beard almost completely hid his face, leaving only deeply set, very light, almost transparent eyes visible. Behind him trotted a large shaggy dog, resembling a wolf. The man stopped a few steps from Aglaya, silently examining her. In his gaze there was no surprise, no pity, no curiosity. There was only calm, ancient attention, like looking at a fallen tree or an animal track. It was the gaze of the taiga itself, wise and indifferent. For Aglaya, this was another hallucination, a deathbed delirium. She closed her eyes again, but the vision didn't disappear. She smelled smoke, dog, and something else sour, bready. The man approached closer. She opened her eyes. He stood over her, blocking the gray sky. He knelt down, making the snow crunch loudly under him. His huge hand in a mitten, with rough, cracked skin, gently, almost weightlessly touched her forehead. Then he just as gently pulled aside the edge of her pant leg, exposing the terrible wound. He looked long at the bone protruding from the flesh, at the clotted blood. Aglaya waited for him to stand and leave, leaving her to die. Anyone would do that. Why bother with a half-dead fugitive? Turning her in was troublesome, helping was dangerous. But he didn't leave. He silently rose, went to two young birches growing nearby, pulled a wide axe from his belt. A few precise, strong blows, and the saplings fell into the snow. He quickly trimmed the branches, measured the needed length, then removed his rope belt, pulled a knife from his bosom, and began cutting the belt into several pieces. All his movements were unhurried, precise, economical, not a single extra gesture. He worked as if he had done this all his life. The dog sat nearby, not taking its intelligent yellow eyes off Aglaya. He knelt beside her again. "Endure, daughter," he said. His voice was low, muffled, as if he hadn't used it for a long time. These were the first words she heard from him. He took her leg in his huge hands. Aglaya screamed as he began to set the bone. The pain was such that she lost consciousness. She came to from a sharp smell, not ammonia, something acrid, homemade. The old man was shaking her shoulder. "Don't sleep yet, too early." Her leg was clamped between two freshly cut poles, tightly bound with ropes. Primitive but sturdy splint. He had stopped the bleeding by sprinkling the wound with some dark powder from a pouch hanging around his neck. "Can you stand?" he asked. Aglaya shook her head. She couldn't even move. The old man sighed. Then, without visible effort, he scooped her up in his arms like a child. He smelled of forest, smoke, and strength. He was incredibly strong. "Hold on," he said shortly and walked. He carried her through the forest. Aglaya faded in and out of consciousness. She saw above her only his beard, frosted from breath, and the low gray sky peeking through black tree branches. The dog ran ahead, blazing the trail. She didn't know how long he carried her. An hour, 3, eternity. Finally, they emerged into a clearing hidden in the densest thicket. Here stood a low, earth-sunken winter hut, built of huge darkened logs. A thin wisp of smoke rose from a stone chimney. Nearby was a small shed and a woodpile. Everything was solidly, durably built for centuries. He carried her inside. Inside was hot, well heated, smelling of dry herbs, bread, and wax. Against the far wall was a wide bench covered with a bearskin. In the corner were small boards resembling icons, darkened without faces. An old believer hermit, one of those who fled the world into the taiga back in Tsarist times. He carefully laid her on the bench, removed her wet, iced boots, cut the pant leg on her injured leg, examined his work. "You'll live," he said without emotion. "The bone is clean, it'll heal." He brought her a mug of hot, scalding herbal decoction. Aglaya drank greedily, feeling the warmth spread through her tormented body. She looked at her savior. Who was he? An angel or just a man? Why had he saved her? She wanted to ask, but had no strength. He seemed to read her thoughts. "I'm Tikhin," he said. "And you? Rest for now. I don't need your name. The Lord brought you, so it must be." He turned to the stove and said no more. Aglaya lay on the bearskin in warmth, in safety, saved at the very last moment on the threshold of death, and couldn't understand if this was the end of her escape or its new, most incredible beginning. The first weeks at Tikhin's winter hut Aglaya spent in semi-oblivion. Fever alternated with chills, pain in her leg a dull, aching throb. Tikhon cared for her silently and efficiently. He changed her bandages soaked in decoctions of bark and moss, gave her bitter infusions, fed her thin gruel of dried meat and boiled grains. He almost never spoke, occasionally dropping short, weighty phrases in an ancient sing-song manner. He never asked who she was or where she came from. For him, she was simply an invalid, a person sent by God for his care. His world was simple and clear. It had no place for the NKVD Article 58 or camps. There were only God, the taiga, and man before them. Gradually, Aglaya began to recover. The pain receded, the fever subsided. She could sit on the bench, leaning back. She observed her savior. Tikhon lived in complete harmony with the forest. His day was scheduled minute by minute according to ancient routines. Morning prayer before the dark boards, then checking snares and traps. During the day, he chopped wood, repaired gear, tanned hides. In the evening, by the light of a splinter, he read a thick church book in a leather binding. His dog was named Siri, and he talked to it more than to her. This harsh, closed world frightened her at first, but then she began to feel its healing power. Here there was no lies, fear, or fuss. Everything was real. Cold, hunger, work, life, and death. When she could hobble around the hut leaning on a stick, Tikhon began giving her simple tasks. She sorted grains, cleaned dried mushrooms, mended his simple clothes. Her slender philologist's fingers, long unaccustomed to anything but heavy camp labor, gradually adapted to the needle. She darned his shirt and suddenly caught herself thinking that this occupation calmed her. For the first time in many years, she was doing something meaningful and useful not just for survival, but for another person. A year passed. The bone healed, though her leg remained slightly shorter forever, and Aglaya limped a bit. She grew stronger, gained weight. Frost and sun colored her face a healthy dark blush. Not a trace remained of the former emaciated prisoner. She learned to understand the taiga. Tikhon, seeing her thirst for knowledge, began teaching her. He showed her edible roots and poisonous herbs, taught her to read tracks in the snow. Here a wolverine passed, here a capercaillie fed, and here by the stream, a wolf spent the night. He taught her to shoot from his old Zarastera burden rifle. The taiga isn't evil or kind, he said. It's fair. It feeds the strong and smart, destroys the weak and foolish. And don't kill animals without need. It's a sin. This was her second academy, far more important than the university. She learned not the languages of dead peoples, but the language of life. She became part of this world. Her past reminded her of itself less and less. Sometimes, looking at her reflection in a bucket of water, she didn't recognize this woman with a weathered face, calm, confident eyes, and strong working hands. Aglaya Wexler had died. Simply Aglaya was born, a taiga dweller, but the sense of danger never left her. One summer day, when they were picking berries on a hillside, she heard a familiar, hated sound, the roar of an airplane. Low over the forest passed a small biplane, the same one that had searched for her in the first days of escape. Patrol. They hadn't stopped the flyovers. Tikhon and Aglaya froze in the bushes, not breathing, until the plane disappeared over the horizon. Searching, Tikhon said shortly. If not you, then another. Who? There are many of our kind here fleeing the world. That day, Aglaya realized she couldn't stay here forever. She was grateful to Tikhon. She had come to love this harsh life, but her presence endangered him too. Sooner or later, they might be discovered. She needed to move on. But where? She began hatching a new plan, more thought out than her first desperate dash. Tikhon sometimes went to a distant winter hut, a few days' journey away, where he traded furs for salt, gunpowder, and other necessities with hermits like himself. From them, he heard that far south, on the Angara tributaries, there were settlements of free prospectors, geologists, hunters. There, among people without pasts, one could get lost, obtain new documents, or live without them. It was risky, but a real path to a new life. She began preparing. She saved food, making caches of hardtack and jerky. She practiced shooting for hours to make every bullet hit the mark. She memorized the star map to navigate at night. One autumn, almost 2 years after her arrival, Tikhon fell ill. He returned from hunting wet, frozen. By night, he had a high fever, pneumonia, the same illness that nearly killed Stepan. Now the roles reversed. Aglaya became the mistress of the winter hut. She chopped wood, carried water, hunted small game. She gave Tikhon the same herbs he had once used to treat her. For several days, he was on the brink. She sat by his bench, changing cold compresses on his forehead, and prayed, not to the dark boards in the corner, but to some inner god of her own, asking not to take this man, the only one who had shown her kindness. This was her trial, a test of whether she had learned the taiga's lessons. Tikhon survived. He was weak for a long time, but by the start of winter, he could get up. He looked at Aglaya with new eyes. In them was not just calm acceptance, but respect. He understood she was ready. One morning, he silently laid out items on the table. An old but reliable compass, a good hunting knife in a leather sheath, a pouch of salt, and a small supply of gunpowder and shot. "Your path is toward the southern sun," he said, pointing south. 10 days' walk to the big water, and their people, God knows what kind. Go with him. He crossed her with a wide, slow gesture. The farewell was silent. They both understood it was forever. She turned at the forest edge. The old man stood on the threshold of his winter hut. Huge, bearded, resembling a forest spirit. He didn't wave, he just watched her go. Aglaya walked south. Now she was not a victim fleeing pursuit. She was an experienced, self-confident tracker. She moved cautiously, avoiding dangerous places, sleeping not in dugouts but in simple shelters of snow and spruce branches to leave no traces. She ate what the taiga provided. She had become part of it. But the closer she approached her presumed goal, the stronger the anxiety grew. The world of people frightened her now more than the wild forest. She had grown unaccustomed to them. Over these years, she had hardly spoken. Her speech became abrupt, guttural. She had forgotten how to smile. She was approaching the border of her solitary world, beyond which awaited new, unknown danger, and she didn't know if she was ready for it. On the 10th day of her journey, she emerged onto a high bank of a large ice-bound river. On the opposite shore, a few kilometers away, smoke was visible, a settlement. The goal was close, and it was here that a new trap awaited her. Crossing the river, she saw fresh wolf tracks on the ice, and nearby, wolf prints. A large pack. They were heading the same way as her, toward the settlement. A hungry winter pack emerging to human habitation in search of easy prey. She was between them and the people. Another 3 years passed. Aglaya didn't stay in that first settlement on the Angara. She instinctively felt that any permanent place was a trap. She became a nomad. In winter, she hunted fur-bearing animals in the most remote corners of the taiga. In summer, she hired on for seasonal work with geological parties or free prospectors as a cook, laundress, laborer. She was known as the Silent Aglaya, a woman without a past, strong, enduring, and unsociable. No one asked extra questions. In these parts, everyone had their own skeleton in the closet. She learned to live among people while remaining invisible. She changed several names, moving from place to place, never staying longer than 1 season. Her limp became almost unnoticeable, and her face and hands so roughened by wind and work that it was impossible to recognize the former Leningrad student in her. She almost believed that the past had left her. The file on the fugitive prisoner Aglaya Wexler had probably long been lost in the archives, covered in dust. The search stopped a year after her escape, when main forces were thrown at capturing more important enemies of the people. She was considered dead in the taiga, eaten by beasts or frozen. It was easier for everyone that way, but the past doesn't die. It just lies in wait to strike at the most unexpected moment. The mistake she made was trivial, almost accidental. In the 5th year of her wanderings, working as a cook in a small artel on the Podkamenia Tunguska River, she succumbed to a momentary weakness. The artel chief, a former frontline soldier named Pyotr Zakharovich, an honest and decent man, offered to help her with documents. "You can't live like this, Aglaya. Without papers, you're a bug. I have a friend in the district center, a passport clerk. We'll say you lost them, a fire victim. We'll get you a new passport." Aglaya refused for a long time, but weariness from eternal life on the edge took its toll. She agreed. She gave a fictitious name and surname, invented a legend. Pyotr Zakharovich passed her data to his acquaintance. The passport clerk in distant Turkinsk was vigilant. Checking data for the new document, he made a standard inquiry through the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Was there a woman matching the description wanted? And the system, though cumbersome, worked. The description: age, approximate height, gray eyes, slight limp vaguely matched the features in one old, long-closed file. A file that one stubborn state security major had never archived. Major Gromov had aged in these 5 years. He had been promoted to lieutenant colonel, transferred from camp security to the regional MGB office in Krasnoyarsk. He no longer dealt with fugitive searches, but the Vexler case stuck in his memory like a splinter. It was the only unsolved case in his impeccable career. He didn't believe that girl had died. Her desperate audacity spoke of an incredible will to live. When the report from Turkinsk landed on his desk, he immediately knew it was her. He personally flew to the area. For him, this became a matter of honor, the final chord in his service. He wanted to look into the eyes of the woman who had managed to deceive not only him but the taiga itself. Aglaya sensed the danger before it took real shape. One day, a seaplane arrived in the settlement with unfamiliar men in civilian clothes. They didn't ask questions, just looked around, talked to the artel chief. In one of them, elderly, with a tired face and piercing gaze, she recognized the type of people she had fled from all her life. Instinct, honed by years of survival, screamed, "Run!" That night, taking nothing but a knife, a small food supply, and her old burden rifle, which she always kept ready, Aglaya left the settlement. She dissolved into the taiga again, her only true home. Gromov, arriving at the artel and learning that the silent Aglaya had disappeared, merely smirked. The beast sensed the hunter. He didn't organize a large manhunt with soldiers and dogs like the first time. He understood that against such an opponent it was useless. She would escape, confuse the tracks, dissolve. He acted smarter. He gathered the best local event hunters, people for whom the taiga was home. He didn't tell them he was searching for a political prisoner. He announced that a dangerous criminal who had killed several people was wanted. He promised a huge reward, and the hunters, knowing this land like the back of their hand, followed her trail. The last, final hunt began, but now the opponents were equal. On one side, Gromov with his experience, authority, and help from the best trackers. On the other, Aglaya, who in 5 years had become part of this nature herself. She didn't flee headlong. She moved slowly, zigzagging, using all the tricks Tikhon and life itself had taught her. She walked through water, over stony screes where no tracks remain, moved at night. But the hunters were relentless. They followed on her heels. She saw traces of their camps, found still warm campfire coals. They breathed down her neck. The climax came a week later. She tried to head north to the Puturana Plateau into completely wild, uninhabited places, but the pursuers anticipated her maneuvers and cut off her path, driving her onto a narrow rocky ledge overhanging a raging mountain river. Below was a sheer wall dozens of meters high, behind a narrow isthmus already being combed by hunters. She was trapped in a real stone one. All paths were cut off. Now it was truly all over. There was no snowdrift to burrow into, no forest to hide in. Only bare rocks and the roaring water below. She pressed against the rock, preparing for the last fight. She had no intention of surrendering. She would sell her life dearly. She checked her rifle. Only 3 cartridges left. She waited. Soon, figures appeared on the isthmus. 2 event hunters, and behind them a no longer young but still erect man in civilian clothes, Gromov. He saw her. Their gazes met across 100 meters. He raised his hand, ordering the hunters to stop, and walked forward, alone. He didn't draw his pistol. He just walked toward her, his long elusive target. Aglaya raised her rifle, caught his figure in the sights. 1 shot and it would all end. Her finger rested on the trigger. He was her enemy, the embodiment of the system that had broken her life. He was the cause of all her suffering. But she hesitated. To kill a man in cold blood, through sights. In all these years, she had killed only animals and only for food. Could she cross this final line? Gromov came very close, within earshot. He stopped 20 paces away. He looked at her not as a criminal, but with some strange, almost scientific interest. He looked at the woman with a weathered dark face in homemade leather clothes, rifle in hand. He saw not the student from Leningrad, he saw a living taiga legend. "Wexler?" he asked, and his voice, amplified by the echo of the rocks, resounded over the river. She didn't answer. She just looked into his eyes, and her finger froze on the trigger. Her entire 5-year odyssey, all her struggle, condensed into this moment, this silent duel on the edge of the abyss. The instant stretched into eternity. The river roared below. The wind tousled her matted hair. Gromov looked at the rifle barrel pointed at his chest and at the woman holding it. In her eyes, he saw no fear, no hatred, only bottomless cold weariness and unyielding resolve. He saw not just a fugitive contra. He saw a person who had passed through purgatory and survived. A person who had paid such a price for her freedom that he, Lieutenant Colonel Gromov, couldn't even imagine. And he understood that he couldn't arrest her. It would be not just unfair. It would be vulgar. It would be an insult to the very concept of the human spirit. He slowly, demonstratively lowered the hand that had rested on his holster. "The case of Wexler, Aglaya Lazarevna, was closed 3 years ago," he said clearly, though quietly, looking straight into her eyes. "In connection with death from attack by a rogue bear." He lied. The case wasn't closed. It lay in his safe, but now he was closing it for himself forever. He stood another second, as if saying goodbye, then turned sharply and walked back to the hunters. "No one here," he tossed to them. "False lead. We're leaving." The hunters exchanged surprised glances, but an order is an order. In a few minutes, they disappeared behind the rocks. Aglaya stood for a long time, not lowering the rifle. She couldn't believe it. Was this a trap? A trick? But she felt it wasn't. There was no falsity in his voice. He had let her go. Why? Out of pity? Out of respect? Or had he simply tired of this endless, senseless hunt? She would never know the answer. She slowly lowered the rifle. Her hands trembled. The tension of the last days released her, and she nearly fell. She was free. For real this time. She didn't return to the world. She went further north into wild, untrodden places where only rare Evenk hunters had been before her. She built herself a winter hut, similar to Tikhin's, small but sturdy. She lived alone, in complete harmony with the taiga, which became her homeland and her temple. Years passed. Stalin died. Millions of prisoners returned from camps under amnesty. The country changed, but for Aglaya it didn't matter. She was too far away. Her soul had changed too much to return. Her past died finally, and her future was here, in the silent grandeur of mountains and forests. Sometimes hunters wandered to her winter hut. They told the legend of the silent Aglaya, the spirit woman, mistress of the taiga, who could escape any pursuit and whom neither bullet nor illness could take. They didn't know that this legend sat before them, treating them to hot tea from cranberry leaves and silently listening to their stories. She looked at these people, at their faces, and felt infinitely distant from them. Once, already no longer a young woman, she sat on the threshold of her hut watching the sunset paint the snowy peaks pink. She thought about her path. Was it worth it? This stolen youth, these years of loneliness, fear, and deprivation? She didn't know the answer, but she knew one thing. She regretted nothing. The camp would have broken and killed her. The taiga nearly killed her too, but it also forged her into a new person, free. What is freedom? Perhaps it's not the absence of bars, but an inner state where you belong to no one but yourself and the God you believe in or not. When your only law is the law of conscience and nature. She looked at her hands, rough, dark, covered in scars. These were the hands not of a philologist, but of a hunter. She looked at her reflection in a copper basin, a face etched with wrinkles like the bark of an old tree, and eyes reflecting the gray Siberian sky. Who is this woman? Aglaya Wexler? No, she died long ago. A taiga hermit? A legend, or simply a person who chose her path and walked it to the end? The end of her story was neither happy nor tragic. It was simply logical. She remained where she found her place. Freedom turned out to be not a noisy square in the capital, but the silence of endless forest. The price of this freedom was her entire past life. And watching the fading sun, She thought that perhaps it was a fair price. She was alone, but she was not lonely. With her was the taiga, and that was enough. The last rays of the sun touched her face, and she felt on her cheek the familiar touch of cold wind. This touch was dearer and closer to her than any human embrace. It was the breath of her freedom,